The gavel came down so hard that Anastasia Hawthorne felt the vibration through the marble floor beneath her feet, traveling up through her bones like a verdict already written in stone before she had ever opened her mouth. "The ruling stands," declared the arbiter, a gaunt vampire with silver-streaked hair and eyes the color of old bruises. He wore the black sash of the Covenant Court and looked at Anastasia the way one might look at a stray cat that had wandered onto a throne. "Hearthstone Academy will be transferred to Covenant jurisdiction, effective the 1st of next month. All human staff will be reassigned or released. This court is adjourned." "You cannot do this." Anastasia's voice didn't shake. She had promised herself it would not shake. Those children have been enrolled in that school for years. Human children. Their families trust us, trust me, to provide an education that is neutral ground. The Covenant taking full jurisdiction means they lose that. The arbiter folded his hands on the bench. Around the chamber, a dozen vampire representatives watched her with expressions ranging from bored amusement to barely concealed contempt. The Covenant Court sat beneath the city of Millhaven in a cathedral carved from black stone, lit by chandeliers dripping with cold blue flame, and every single person in it was immortal except for Anastasia. "Mrs. Hawthorne," said Councillor Vestara, a woman with white hair coiled at the nape of her neck and a voice like a cello being played, just slightly off-key. "You were permitted to address this court as a courtesy. The blood law governing educational institutions within registered Covenant territory is not open to negotiation. Accept the ruling, echoed another councillor from the far side of the chamber, barely bothering to look up from the documents he was reviewing. Marin, Anastasia's closest colleague and the one person who had agreed to come down here with her, gripped her elbow from behind. "Anna," she whispered urgently, "we tried. You tried. We have to go." Anastasia did not move. 14 years ago, she had taken a job at Hearthstone Academy because it was the only integrated school in Millhaven. One of the rare institutions where both human and vampire children sat in classrooms together, where the curriculum was designed to bridge two worlds that existed in mutual suspicion. She had watched those children grow. She had taught them literature and history, and how to think critically about a world that was more complicated than most adults admitted. She had fought for field trips and library funding, and the right of her students to study the histories of both their peoples without the sanitized, Covenant-approved version of events. And she was not going to stand here in this underground cathedral and watch it dismantled. Because some blood law from 1887 said that any educational institution within 3 miles of a registered Covenant territory automatically fell under vampire jurisdiction when a certain population threshold was met. "I want to appeal," she said clearly. Silence. The cold blue flames in the chandeliers flickered, though there was no draft. The arbiter stared at her. "The ruling of this court is final at this tier. There is no appeal process available to a human civilian." There is one. Anastasia had spent 3 nights reading through the Covenant's own legal archive, the one they made publicly accessible on a locked server that she had needed significant help accessing, help provided by a former student who now worked in Covenant records and still sent her messages on her birthday. Section 47 of the Foundational Covenant Charter states that any ruling affecting an institution of learning where the enrolled population includes individuals of mixed heritage may be appealed directly to the sovereign authority of the Covenant, the Vampire King himself. Every head in the room turned toward her. The arbiter's expression did not change, but something shifted behind his eyes. "No one has invoked that clause in over 200 years. Then I am invoking it now." Marin made a strangled sound behind her. Councillor Vestara rose slowly from her seat. She was extraordinarily beautiful in the way that old paintings were beautiful, technically perfect and completely cold. "Mrs. Hawthorne, I will offer you this warning out of a residual respect for the role your institution has played in this city. King Dorian Ashenvale has not received a civilian appeal in living memory. He does not enjoy having his time wasted. If you stand before him with a case he deems frivolous, the consequences will not simply be the loss of your employment." "I understand the risk," Anastasia said. She did not entirely understand the risk, but she said it anyway. The preparation took 4 days. 4 days during which every person Anastasia trusted told her she was making a catastrophic mistake, Her father called from Corbridge and told her to accept the ruling that fighting vampire politics was like trying to swim upstream in a river that had decided to flow through solid rock. Her department head, Professor Giles, took her to lunch at the cafe on the corner of Aldermere Street and spent 40 minutes explaining in his gentle, precise way why the Covenant King was not a city council member she could simply present a petition to. He was ancient. He was dangerous. He had not built the largest vampire sovereign territory on the eastern seaboard by being sympathetic to human grievances. Even her neighbor, old Mrs. Bellamy, who had lived in the building for 30 years and had once casually mentioned that her late husband had been a vampire liaison officer, pressed a cup of tea into Anastasia's hands and said quietly, "Child, you don't know what you're walking into." Anastasia drank the tea. She thanked everyone. She revised her argument 3 more times, the night before the audience. She sat at her kitchen table surrounded by printed legal documents and handwritten notes, and she let herself feel the fear she had not allowed herself to show in the courtroom. Her hands trembled slightly as she highlighted a passage about the precedent set by the Threnholm Accord of 1923. Her chest was tight. She was a 31-year-old high school English teacher from Corbridge who had ended up in Millhaven by accident and stayed by choice, and tomorrow she was going to stand in front of the Vampire King and argue the case for a school. She straightened the papers. She was terrified. She was going anyway. The Covenant's seat of power in Millhaven was not, as most humans imagined, some crumbling Gothic castle on a hill. It was the Ashenvale Tower, a 60-story glass and black steel structure in the financial district that housed the Covenant's administrative offices in the upper floors, and, according to extremely persistent rumor, an entire subterranean palace beneath it that extended 3 levels below the city's bedrock. The architecture of the lobby was brutally beautiful, all dark marble and soaring ceilings, with reception staff who were uniformly elegant, uniformly pale, and uniformly focused on Anastasia. The moment she stepped through the doors, she wore her best suit. Navy blue, well-tailored, with a cream blouse. She had her documents in a leather folio that had been her mother's. Her hair was pinned back. She looked exactly like what she was, a human woman who had prepared as carefully as she knew how, and she held her chin up as she approached the reception desk. "Anastasia Hawthorne," she said. "I have a formally submitted appeal under Section 47 of the Covenant Charter. I have an audience with His Majesty at 9 o'clock. The receptionist, a young vampire man with dark red eyes and hair so blonde it was nearly white, looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up a telephone that looked like it had been designed by someone who found ordinary telephone design insufficiently intimidating, and he spoke quietly into it in a language she did not recognize. "Someone will collect you," he said. "Wait there." She waited for 11 minutes. She counted. The woman who came to collect her was tall, with dark hair swept severely back and the bearing of someone who had been a soldier in at least 2 centuries. She wore a charcoal uniform with the Covenant sigil at her collar and introduced herself as Seraphine, one of the king's personal staff. "The audience will be brief," Seraphine said as they walked toward the private elevators at the rear of the lobby. "You will address the king as Your Majesty upon first address, and sir thereafter. You will not approach him without invitation. You will not touch him. You will not raise your voice. If he indicates the audience is over, you will leave immediately." "Do you understand?" "Completely," Anastasia said. Seraphine looked at her with something that was not quite respect but was adjacent to it. "You are either very brave or very foolish, Miss Hawthorne." "Most people would say foolish," Anastasia replied. "Most people would be frightened." "I am frightened," Anastasia said honestly. "I am doing it anyway." Something in Seraphine's expression shifted very slightly, and she did not say anything more as the elevator descended. The doors opened not onto an office but onto a corridor of extraordinary beauty, low-lit with amber sconces. The walls panelled in dark wood that had been carved into intricate patterns of interlocking vines, and what appeared to be a history told in images, battles, and treaties and ceremonies stretching back centuries. The carpet was deep and muffled their footsteps completely, and at the end of the corridor was a set of double doors made of something darker than oak, and taller than they had any practical reason to be. Seraphine Sunshine stopped her just outside them. "One more thing," she said quietly. "Whatever you have heard about the king, understand that he is fair. He is not always merciful, but he is fair. If your case is solid, present it clearly. Do not embellish. Do not perform. He will see through it immediately, and it will cost you everything you came here to gain." Anastasia nodded slowly. "Thank you," she said, and she meant it. Seraphine pushed the doors open. The chamber beyond was not what she had expected, which perhaps should not have surprised her, given that nothing about this had been what she expected. It was large but not cavernous, lined with bookshelves that reached the ceiling and crammed with volumes that were clearly old and clearly read. A fire burned in a hearth large enough to walk into. The desk at the center of the room was broad and covered in correspondence and open books and what appeared to be architectural plans, and behind it, standing at the window that looked not outward to the city but downward into an interior garden lit by carefully calibrated lights that mimicked moonlight, was Dorian Ashenvale. She had seen photographs. They did not prepare her. He was tall, considerably taller than she had expected, and he stood with the absolute stillness that she associated with old things, mountains and deep water and ancient stone. His hair was white, not aged white but pure white, the white of fresh snow, and it was swept back from a face that was striking in the way that extreme precision was striking, every feature carved with an exactness that felt intentional rather than accidental. His skin was pale in the way that vampire skin always was, but on him it read not as pallor but as luminosity, a faint cold radiance that she noticed as much as she tried not to. He wore dark clothing that was formal without being ceremonial, as though the occasion of receiving her did not rise to the level of requiring his court attire, which was simultaneously insulting and somehow reassuring. He turned from the window when she entered. His eyes were the grey of deep winter sky, the kind that held the promise of storms. "Mrs. Hawthorne," he said. His voice was low and unhurried and filled the room without effort. "You have invoked a clause of the foundational charter that has not been used since A1803. I find that either impressive or reckless, and I have not yet determined which." "Your Majesty," she said, and did a small internal check to make sure her voice was steady. It was, barely. "With respect, I hope to demonstrate that it is the former." He studied her for a moment. Then he moved to his desk and settled into the chair behind it, gesturing to the chair across from him with one long-fingered hand. "Sit, present your case." She sat. She opened the leather folio. She began. She had rehearsed the argument dozens of times, but she did not rush it. She laid out the blood law that had been applied to Hearthstone Academy, then challenged its applicability point by point. The law had been written in 1887 to address territorial disputes over institutions that had been founded specifically as covenant recruitment grounds pretending to be neutral. Hearthstone had been founded in 1961, registered with both the human municipal government and the covenant simultaneously, with a dual jurisdiction charter that predated the current blood law by several years. If the 1887 law superseded the 1961 charter, then the Threnholm Accord, which protected existing dual jurisdiction agreements from retroactive amendment, was effectively nullified, and nullifying Threnholm had implications that extended far beyond one school in Millhaven. Dorian listened. He did not interrupt, which was not what she had anticipated. He watched her with complete attention, the way a person read something they were deciding whether to believe, and once he reached forward and picked up a pen and made a note on a pad beside his desk. And that single gesture, the idea that something she said was worth noting, sent a complicated flood of something through her chest that was not entirely attributable to relief. When she finished, the room was quiet for a long moment. "You read the 1923 Threnholm Accord in its original form?" he asked. "I read the primary source document and 3 secondary analyses. I can provide citations." A pause. "The Covenant's legal team did not catch the Threnholm conflict." "No, Your Majesty." Another pause, longer this time. "Who helped you access the Covenant archive?" She met his eyes and said nothing. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. It might have been amusement. "I see, you are protecting a source." "I am presenting a legal argument," she said carefully. "The method by which I gathered the materials does not affect the validity of the argument itself." "No," he said slowly, "it does not." He set down the pen. He leaned back in his chair with the ease of someone who had never been anything other than entirely confident in any room he had ever occupied. Tell me, Miss Hawthorne, why this school? I have reviewed your record. You are an exceptional teacher by any measure. You could teach anywhere. Why spend 14 years fighting for an institution that sits in one of the most politically complicated districts in this city? She had not expected a personal question. She took a breath. Because the children in that school are extraordinary, she said, and not in the way adults usually mean when they say that. They are not extraordinary because they are talented or unusually gifted, though many of them are. They are extraordinary because they are 11 and 12 and 14 years old, and they sit across from each other in classrooms every day, human children and vampire children, and they figure out how to coexist. They argue about books and steal each other's pencils and form friendships that their parents sometimes cannot understand. They are doing the thing that their parents and grandparents and ancestors, going back centuries, have failed to do, and every single system around them, yours included, Your Majesty, keeps trying to take that away from them by sorting them into separate categories and applying separate rules. She stopped. She had not meant to say all of that. The legal argument had been careful and structured, and she had gone entirely off script. Dorian Ashenvale was looking at her with an expression she could not read. I apologize, she said. That was not part of the formal appeal. No, he said. It was not. He was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough that she began to recalculate all her assumptions about how this was going. It was, however, significantly more honest than the legal argument, and both were more compelling than I anticipated. He stood. I will review the Threnham conflict and give my ruling within 72 hours. You will be notified through official channels. She stood as well, gathering her folio. Thank you for hearing me, Your Majesty.
Mims Hawthorne.
His voice stopped her before she reached the door. She turned. He was standing on the other side of the desk, and this close to the firelight she could see the complexity of his expression, something between careful deliberation and something else she could not name. The courage required to come here and present that argument, knowing what you were risking, is not a quality I encounter often, in any quarter. She held his gaze. I had a good reason, she said. Yes, he said quietly. I believe you did. She left. She rode the elevator back up in complete silence. Seraphine beside her, and stepped out into the marble lobby of Ashenvale Tower, and through the glass doors into the cold morning air of Millhaven, and only when she was half a block away, when the tower was behind her, and the ordinary noise of the city was around her, did she allow herself to stop and breathe. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against her thighs and breathed until they stopped. The ruling came in 48 hours, not 72. It came not through official channels, but through Seraphine, who arrived at the door of Anastasia's apartment at 7 in the morning, carrying an envelope sealed with the Covenant's mark, and wearing an expression of controlled astonishment, as though she were delivering news she had not expected to deliver. The ruling overturned the Covenant Court's decision. The Threnholm conflict was formally acknowledged. The blood law application was declared invalid as applied to Hearthstone Academy, and the school's dual jurisdiction charter was confirmed and codified in a new protective designation that would require the sovereign authority's personal approval to alter. At the bottom of the document, in handwriting rather than the formal typeface of the official text, were 3 words: "The school stands," and beneath that, a signature she recognized. Maren screamed when Anastasia called her. It was a genuine, unambiguous scream of joy, and Anastasia laughed for the first time in what felt like weeks. Professor Giles sent a formal note of congratulation that was so thoroughly seasoned with bewildered admiration that she read it twice just to appreciate the grammatical construction of his disbelief. Mrs. Bellamy brought over a bottle of wine that Anastasia suspected was older than her parents combined and said simply, "Well done, child," with the satisfaction of someone who had privately bet on the right outcome all along. And Anastasia went back to work. She had not expected to see Dorian Ashenvale again. That was not a judgment or an assumption about his intentions. It was simply a realistic assessment of the probability that the sovereign authority of the Covenant would have ongoing reason to interact with a high school English teacher whose legal dispute had been resolved. She put him in the category of extraordinary things that happened once and were carried forward as memory rather than continued experience. She thought about the grey of his eyes rather more often than was probably appropriate, and the precise way he had said her name, and the handwriting at the bottom of the ruling document. She thought about these things and did not act on them, because she was a practical woman and he was a vampire king, and the distance between those two things was not metaphorical, which made the appearance of Seraphine outside her classroom door on a Thursday afternoon, 6 weeks after the ruling, rather surprising. Anastasia excused herself from the class, stepped into the hallway and said, "Is something wrong?" Seraphine handed her a small card. It was black, with silver lettering, and it bore the Covenant seal and a single line. His Majesty requests the pleasure of your company for dinner, Friday at 8. Ashenvale Tower, 42nd floor. The car will collect you at 7:30. Anastasia looked at the card for a long moment. Then she looked at Seraphine. Is this formal? Is there a political purpose I should prepare for? Seraphine's expression was doing something complicated that she appeared to be working hard to contain. I was told it is dinner, she said. I was given no further parameters. Anastasia looked at the card again. Tell His Majesty I accept, she said. Seraphine walked away, and Anastasia stood in the hallway for precisely 3 seconds before her student Tomas opened the classroom door and said, Mrs. Hawthorne. Priya set Felix's worksheet on fire, and she walked back in without giving herself time to think about the fact that her heart was beating considerably faster than it had any reason to. She wore deep green. It was a decision she made after 40 minutes of consideration and abandoned 3 potential alternatives, and she felt only moderately ridiculous about the amount of thought she had dedicated to it. The car arrived at exactly 7:30, a black vehicle with tinted windows and a driver who said nothing and navigated Millhaven's evening traffic with the smooth inevitability of water finding its own level. The 42nd floor of Ashenvale Tower was a private dining room, and it was extraordinary in a way she had stopped allowing herself to expect. Floor-to-ceiling windows on 3 sides showed the city blazing against the dark, and the table was set for 2, with the kind of precision that spoke to either a professional staff or the personal attention of someone who cared about details. There were candles and real flowers and wine already poured, a deep burgundy that caught the candlelight with a warmth that made her chest do something inconvenient. Dorian Ashenvale was there before her. He stood at one of the windows with his hands clasped loosely behind him, looking out at the city with an expression she was beginning to recognize as his default mode of watching the world, attentive and assessing, and entirely unperturbed by whatever he found there. He had dressed for the occasion, still dark, still formal, but with a deliberateness that she noticed and did not mention. He turned when she entered, and the expression on his face was not the careful neutrality of the audience chamber. It was something quieter and more unguarded, and it lasted only a moment before his composure reassembled itself, but she had seen it. Mrs. Hawthorne, he said. Mr. Ashenvale, she replied, and watched one corner of his mouth pull upward. Your Majesty, he corrected, but gently, as though it were a jest rather than a requirement. I know, she said. I was making a point. What point? She sat down when he gestured toward the table. That whatever this is, it might be more comfortable if the formality could be shared rather than flowing in one direction. He considered that as he took the chair across from her. You mean that you find it uncomfortable to call me by my title while I address you by name? I find the power differential implied by the protocol somewhat conspicuous in a room with only 2 people in it, she said, another almost smile. Then I will call you Anastasia, he said, and you may call me Dorian, within this room. Within this room, she agreed, and lifted her wine glass. He did not drink. She had known he would not, had known the wine was for her, and the dinner would be for her, and that he had arranged all of it as a gesture without direct personal benefit, and somehow that made her feel the gesture more acutely rather than less. They talked. She had not anticipated how easily they would talk. She had brought with her a vague notion that the conversation would be careful and political, conducted at a distance, enforced by the weight of everything they were to each other in the context of their respective worlds. But Dorian, freed from the formality of the audience chamber and apparently inclined to allow the same freedom to the room around him, spoke to her with a directness and an intelligence that she found deeply engaging. He had read everything. Not the sanitized versions or the popular summaries, but the primary sources, the arguments, the counter-arguments, the revisions of understanding across centuries. He had opinions about them that were neither simple nor safely mainstream. He disagreed with her about 3 things before the first course was cleared, not aggressively but precisely, with the specific kind of intellectual confidence that came from having genuinely considered the opposing view and rejected it for reasons he could articulate. She pushed back. Twice she changed his mind on a specific point, watched him reconsider in real time, and acknowledged the revision. Twice he held his ground with an argument she could not dismantle, and she told him so, and the look he gave her when she said it was not triumph but something warmer than that. She asked him about the subterranean palace. He confirmed its existence, described it with the unself-conscious directness of someone discussing a feature of their home that happened to be unusual, and asked her if she wanted to see it. She said yes before she had entirely finished processing the question, though the lower levels were accessed through a private elevator that required his specific biometric, and was, he mentioned as they descended, the only entrance still operational from the tower side. The palace itself was not the Gothic labyrinth of her imagination. It was instead a living space of extraordinary accumulated beauty. Rooms built and rebuilt across 3 centuries of habitation, each bearing the marks of a different period in his long life. The oldest rooms were stone and candlelit, hung with tapestries whose colors had not faded because the atmosphere had been preserved with the same meticulous care that he applied to everything she was learning, he touched. The newer rooms were more modern, though modern here meant mid-20th century at the most recent, and everywhere there were books, the same proliferation of reading material she had noticed in his office above, as though the act of gathering knowledge was as essential to him as anything else. He showed her a library that took up an entire underground floor, and she stopped in the doorway and could not speak for a moment. "You have been collecting these for how long?" she managed. "The oldest pieces in this room date to the 13th century, he said. "I was considerably less careful with them then than I am now. You personally collected them." "Some. Others came to me through trade, through gift, through acquisition during political transitions." A slight pause. "Through conflict." She looked at him sideways. "How old are you?" "Older than the Threnholm Accord," he said. "That is not an answer." "It is an answer. It is simply not the specific one you asked for." He moved to a shelf and drew out a volume with the practiced ease of long familiarity, opening it to a page with a small illustration of a city she did not recognize. "I was born human in a city that no longer exists under that name in 1287. I was turned at 26. I have been what I am now for longer than most nations have existed." She stood beside him looking at the illustration. "Does it ever become abstract?" The time itself, yes. The things I remember, no." He closed the book and returned it. "The faces I remember, the conversations, the specific quality of light in a room I have not stood in for 6 centuries. Memory becomes more selective, but more vivid simultaneously. It is the strangest kind of clarity." She thought about that for a long time. They walked the rest of the library in a companionable quiet that did not feel empty, and when the hour grew late, he walked her back to the lobby and said good night with a formality that was somehow warmer than informality would have been. In the car going home, she looked out at the city and thought about a man who remembered the specific quality of light in rooms 6 centuries gone, and she understood, with the particular precision of someone who had spent a long time learning how to know her own mind, that she was in considerable trouble. The trouble compounded. He came to the school, not in any official capacity, not announced, and not in the company of any entourage. Simply present one afternoon at the back of her classroom when she was teaching her junior class the ethics and aesthetics of unreliable narration. He slipped in during the middle of a discussion and stood against the back wall, and for 5 minutes she did not know he was there, because Tomas was making an exceptionally spirited argument about whether the narrator of a particular novel was deluded or deliberately manipulative, and her attention was entirely on the argument. When she noticed him, she did not stop the class. She held his gaze for a single second, acknowledged him with the faint tilt of her head that she used to indicate she had registered in something without wanting to interrupt the flow of discussion, and went back to Tomas and his narrator. He stayed for the full 40 minutes. He did not say anything. He watched the class with that same quality of intense attention he brought to everything, and when the bell rang and the students filed out, several of them noticing him and responding with the full spectrum of reactions ranging from awe to determined casualness, he waited until the room was empty before he came forward. "Your students," he said, "argue exceptionally well." "I know," she said, gathering notebooks from the desks they had been left on. "It is my primary professional goal." He picked up a notebook that had slid off the edge of a desk and handed it to her. The ordinary domesticity of the gesture was startling enough that she took it without thinking. "Tomas makes a structural error in his reasoning at the point where he conflates intent with effect," he said. "I know," she said again. "I was going to let him find it himself." "Is that pedagogy or optimism?" "It is both," she said, "and it usually works." He looked around the classroom with its student artwork on the walls, and its overloaded bookshelves, and its pervasive mild chaos of a room that was genuinely used every day, and something in his expression did the unguarded thing again. The brief open quality that she thought might be wonder, though she was not certain he would have used that word for it. "I have not been in a classroom in 300 years, he said quietly. "The last time I attended a lecture, the speaker was considered radical for suggesting that the earth was older than the standard theological model allowed." "What did you think of the lecture?" "I thought he was right and considerably underestimating." He looked back at her. "I also thought that the quality of the instruction mattered more than the content, and that thought has not changed." She held his gaze. "Is that why you came?" A pause. "I am not certain," he said, which was an extraordinary admission from someone who always appeared to be absolutely certain of everything. He left without clarifying further, and Anastasia stood in her empty classroom and pressed her hand flat against her sternum as though she could settle whatever was happening beneath it by applying gentle pressure. The dinners continued. 3 times in the following month, and each time the conversation went deeper and longer, and the careful formal distance between them shifted by degrees that were individually small and collectively significant. She told him about growing up in Corbridge with a mother who taught music and a father who repaired clocks, and a childhood that was ordinary in all the best ways. He told her about the city that no longer existed and the life he had led before transformation, and the long, strange process of learning to be what he was now, which had taken, he said, considerably longer than most vampires admitted. "There is a tendency within the Covenant," he told her, one evening, the city dark and gleaming outside the windows, to treat the transition as a completion rather than a complication, as though everything that one was before becomes irrelevant, superseded by what one is after. "I have never found that to be true." He paused. "The man I was at 26 still influences every decision I make. He simply has 700 years of additional information to work with." "Is that why your library is the way it is?" she asked. "Because he wanted to keep learning." Dorian looked at her for a long moment. "No one has ever asked me that. I find that difficult to believe. People ask about the collection. They ask about specific pieces, their age, their provenance, their monetary value. They do not ask about the impulse behind it." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes, that is exactly why." She reached across the table and placed her hand over his before she had consciously decided to do it. His skin was cool against hers, not cold, not disturbingly cold, but noticeably different in the way that distinguished him from everything she had been accustomed to associating with comfort and warmth. He looked down at her hand. He did not pull away. "Anastasia," he said. And the ways he said her name in that moment was different from every other time he had said it. Charged with something that she recognized because she had been feeling the same thing for several weeks and had been conducting a careful internal debate about whether acknowledging it was wise. "I know," she said. "I am aware of all the complications." "Name one," he said, which was not what she expected. She almost laughed. "You are immortal and I am not." "Yes." "You are the sovereign authority of an entire political body, and I teach high school English." "Also yes." "The Covenant Court already has a dim view of my existence and will view any connection between us as either a threat or a manipulation." He turned his hand beneath hers and his fingers closed around her hand, and the certainty and gentleness of the grip made something in her chest ache, with a specificity that she was going to have to examine later when she was alone and composed. "All of those things are true," he said. "None of them change what is also true, which is that I have spent 700 years moving through this world, and I have not once, in all that time, sat across a table from someone and wanted the conversation to last indefinitely." He held her gaze with the steadiness of deep water. "I find that significant." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "So do I." And the relief on his face was the most human thing she had ever seen on it. The danger came without warning, as it always did in matters of vampire politics, arriving not as a formal threat but as an acceleration of events that had been building beneath the surface while she had been paying attention to other things. Councillor Vestara requested a private audience with Anastasia. Not with the king. With her directly, which should have been the first signal, because Vestara had not previously shown any inclination toward direct communication with humans she considered beneath her political notice. They met at a neutral location, a private room in one of the old hotels in the Covenant district that catered to both human and vampire clientele. Vestara arrived exactly on time, which was itself notable, and sat across from Anastasia with the composed precision of someone who had decided exactly what she was going to say and how she was going to say it.
You are not stupid,
Vestara began, which was not a compliment so much as an acknowledgement. "So I will not treat this as though you require the obvious explained to you. The king's interest in you has been observed, it has been discussed, and there are members of the Covenant's inner circle who find it troubling." Anastasia kept her hands flat on the table. "Why are you telling me this rather than the king?" "Because I am telling you this rather than bringing it before the council, which is the alternative I am currently forestalling." Vestara tilted her head slightly. "Dorian Ashenvale has led this covenant for 3 centuries. His authority is absolute, his judgment has historically been sound, and his personal life has been his own province without interference. But the political climate right now is not stable. There are 3 separate faction disputes in the outer territories that he is managing simultaneously, and 2 of those factions have leaders who are looking for any possible leverage point, any suggestion of instability or distraction at the sovereign level that they can use to push their own positions." "You are telling me I am a liability," Anastasia said. "I am telling you," Vestara said carefully, "that the appearance of a connection between the king and a human woman who publicly challenged his court and won, who then appears to be receiving ongoing personal attention from the king himself, is precisely the kind of narrative that enemies of the Covenant will weaponize. They will say he is compromised. They will say the ruling that preserved your school was not based on legal merit but on personal interest. They will use it to argue that his judgment cannot be trusted." Anastasia was quiet for a moment. "That argument would be wrong. The legal basis for the ruling was sound, I proved it." "Yes," Vestara said. "And legal correctness and political reality are not always the same thing." There was a silence between them. "What are you asking me to do?" Anastasia said. Vestara's eyes were very old. "I am not asking you anything," she said. "I am giving you information. What you do with it is your choice." She paused. "I will say that the individuals who are watching this situation are not, all of them, people whose methods are limited to political maneuvering. Some of them have significantly fewer scruples about how they achieve their objectives." She left, and Anastasia sat in the private room for a long time after she had gone, thinking about the weight of 700 years, and the fragility of political structures, and the way that the people around power were so often more dangerous than the power itself. She did not tell Dorian about the meeting immediately. She spent 2 days arguing with herself about it, which she later recognized as a mistake rooted not in any intent to deceive him, but in a misplaced instinct towards self-sufficiency that did not account for what was at stake. The threat materialized before she made her decision. She was leaving the school on a Wednesday evening, later than usual, because she had stayed to reorganize the classroom library in a way that had been nagging at her for weeks, and the street outside was quiet in the specific way that city streets sometimes were between the rush of commuter traffic and the later movement of evening. She was thinking about book arrangement and not about anything else. which was why she did not notice the vampires who fell into step behind her until she was half a block from the school. She noticed them when she noticed that they were matching her pace precisely, which was not the behavior of strangers sharing a sidewalk. She turned at the corner casually, confirming that they turned with her, and then she was walking faster and looking for the lit windows of open businesses and calculating the distance to a crowd. They were faster. Of course they were faster. What happened next happened quickly. She was pulled into an alley between two buildings, and one of them, a man with the silver-streaked eyes of old vampire bloodlines and an accent she could not place, said quietly, "We are going to deliver a message to the king through you, Miss Hawthorne. You are simply the medium." She was aware, in a small and very cold part of her mind, that she was in serious trouble. She was also aware that she had not screamed, partly because she was processing too fast for screaming, and partly because there was no one within earshot who would have responded to her advantage. She tried to think of anything in her preparation for vampire political situations that covered this specific circumstance, and she found nothing. What she found instead was a low sound that she felt before she heard, a sound like distant thunder, and then Dorian Ashenvale was in the alley. She did not see him arrive. He was simply not there, and then he was, between her and the two vampires, and the quality of stillness she had always found remarkable in him had inverted entirely, replaced by something that raised every hair on her arms and sent her backward against the wall by simple instinct. He was not loud. He was not performing. He was, in the most precise sense possible, dangerous, in the same category as things that were dangerous without trying, cliffs and deep currents, and the specific quality of air before a major storm. "Release her interest," he said, and his voice had lost everything conversational and landed in a register that was purely command. The two vampires were not small or young by vampire reckoning. The one who had spoken to her took a step back. The other was less inclined. He made a motion toward Dorian that was quick enough that Anastasia could not fully track it, and what followed was brief and absolute, lasting perhaps 4 seconds and ending with both vampires on the ground in postures of defeat that were not. She noted with relief the postures of death. He turned to her. His composure was returning, the storm quality receding, and his eyes moved over her with an intensity that was both clinical and deeply not clinical. "Are you hurt?" "No," she said. "I am very shaken, and I will deal with that later, but I am not hurt." He crossed to her in 2 steps, and his hands came up to her face with a gentleness that was not what she had just watched him apply to anyone else, cupping her jaw and tilting her face toward him, checking her over with the same unhurried thoroughness he brought to everything, his eyes moving carefully over face, her neck, her hands. "You are certain, Dorian?" She covered his hands with hers. "I am all right." The expression on his face in that moment was one she had not seen before. It was not the controlled assessment of the audience chamber, or the warmth of the dinner table, or the wonder she had glimpsed in her classroom. It was something rawer than all of those. A look that spoke of several hundred years of composure coming very close to its outer limit. "I knew," he said quietly. 20 minutes ago, I became aware that something was wrong. I cannot explain the mechanism precisely. I knew, and I came." She thought about that. She thought about the specific quality of knowing he was describing, the kind that did not require a logical chain, and she understood that she felt something similar. She had felt it since the first morning she had walked out of this tower and stood on the sidewalk with shaking hands. The beginnings of an orientation toward him that had nothing to do with strategy or prudence. "Vestara came to see me," she said, 2 days ago. He went very still. "She told me there are members of the inner circle who see me as a political liability, that there are people watching your connection to me and waiting for a way to use it against you." She held his gaze. "I should have told you immediately. I was trying to figure out how to handle it on my own, which was a miscalculation." He stepped back slightly, enough to look at her fully. "You were trying to protect me." "I was trying to be practical, Anastasia." He said her name with a gravity that was not reproach but something more complicated. "What is happening between us is not something I intend to conduct from behind a wall of strategic consideration. I have done that for 3 centuries with everything else. I do not wish to do it with you," she breathed. "Then what do you wish to do?" I wish to be honest with you, he said. Which means telling you that the individuals who sent those two are from the Morthon faction, which is the most significant of the 3 disputes I am currently managing, and they have just made an extraordinarily serious mistake by targeting you. I wish to tell you that this escalation is something I am going to address directly, and you are not to be concerned that it endangers what is between us. I wish to tell you that what is between us is the most important thing in my personal experience in a very long time, and I am not willing to allow political maneuvering to alter that reality. She looked at him for a long moment. The alley was cold and lit only by the spill of a distant street lamp, and 2 vampires were still unmoving on the ground behind him, and she was still shaking in the deep internal way that adrenaline created. And she said, "Dorian, I know what I feel. I have known for weeks. I want you to know that it is not going to change based on how complicated things get." He moved back to her. He was careful, always careful with her, approaching in the way that spoke of enormous restraint voluntarily maintained, and he took her hands and held them between his, and he said, I know, because you are the least likely person I have ever encountered to say something you do not mean." She leaned into him. His arms came around her, and he held her with a certainty that was not possessive but protective in a way that felt entirely different, the way that safety felt when it was chosen rather than imposed. "What happens now?" she asked against his shoulder. "Now," he said, "I take you somewhere safe and I deal with Morthane, Dorian, Anastasia. I am not going to be managed." A pause, "I know. I am going to deal with Morthane, and you are going to be present for the process, and nothing about it will be done without your knowledge." Another pause. "Is that acceptable?" she considered. "That is acceptable." The confrontation with the Morthane faction took place 2 days later in the Covenant Court. Summoned by royal mandate and attended by the full council and every senior representative of the 3 outer territory factions. Anastasia was present, seated not in the petitioner's position, but at the right-hand side of the king's formal seat, which was a placement so politically significant that she heard the actual sound of the room's collective reaction to it. Dorian addressed the court with the formal authority of 3 centuries of sovereignty, and he was not angry, which made him more frightening rather than less. He presented the evidence of the attack on Anastasia with the precise clarity of someone who had already decided the outcome and was performing the procedural requirements as a courtesy to the institution rather than a necessity. He named the Morthane faction as responsible. He cited the specific provisions of the ancient code that the attack had violated. He articulated the consequences when Lord Morthane, a tall vampire with the bearing of someone accustomed to intimidating the people around him, tried to argue that the attack had been a private action of individuals without faction authorization. Dorian said, simply, "I know otherwise, as do you." And the weight of that sentence, the absolute certainty of it, closed the argument before it could open. The Morthane faction was placed under formal censure and stripped of 2 of its 3 outer territory claims, a consequence so significant that Anastasia saw even Vestara, who was generally immune to visible reactions, go very still. After the court was dismissed, as people filed out, Vestara passed Anastasia's chair. She did not stop, but she said, very quietly, without looking at her, "You hold yourself well in rooms like this." It was not an apology, but from Vestara, Anastasia suspected it was about as close as was available. In the months that followed, the shape of Anastasia's life changed in ways she had not anticipated, and found upon examination that she welcomed rather than feared. The school continued to flourish under its codified dual jurisdiction protection. Tomas did find the structural error in his narrator argument on his own, 3 weeks after Dorian had pointed it out to her, and the essay he wrote correcting it was one of the best pieces of literary analysis she had read from a student in years. She sent Dorian a copy of it, with a note that said only, he found it. The response came back within an hour. "Of course he did. You taught him how to look." She and Dorian fell into a rhythm that was theirs and no one else's, made up of late evenings in the underground library and dinners in the 42nd floor room and long conversations that ranged from the medieval political structures of cities that no longer existed to the specific problems with her classroom's ventilation system, which he had, without consulting her, arranged to have fixed, and she had been simultaneously annoyed and deeply touched by that, and told him both things. And he had listened to both with equal attention and then said that the ventilation system had been inadequate, and that her objection to the process of its correction was noted, and that he would consult her before making similar decisions in the future. "You actually mean that?" she said. "I mean everything I say to you," he replied, with the matter-of-fact simplicity of someone for whom this was not a virtue requiring acknowledgement, but simply a fact about himself. She had always thought of her life as full. She had her work, which she loved with a genuine and undiminished passion, and her friendships, and her apartment with its overloaded bookshelves that had always felt like a perfectly sufficient universe. She had not known that it was also, in some specific way, waiting. She would have argued against that characterization before she had reason to revise it. She would have said she was entirely complete without a partnership, which was true, and that she was not looking for anything, which was also true. What she had not accounted for was the possibility of finding something without looking for it. He told he loved her on a Tuesday, which she had not expected because she had vaguely imagined such a declaration, if it came, arriving on some more dramatically appropriate occasion. They were in the library, and she was reading, and he had been reading something else, and the room was comfortable and warm, and he had simply looked up from his book and said, "I love you. I want you to know that clearly, without it being implied or suggested. I love you, Anastasia." She put down her book. She looked at him across the library table with his white hair and his winter sky eyes and 700 years of gathered experience behind them. She thought about Section 47 of the Covenant Charter and the cold blue flames in the court chamber and the handwriting at the bottom of a ruling document. She thought about the way he had looked at her in an alley with his composure at its absolute limit. She thought about a man who was born in a city that no longer existed and had spent centuries collecting books because a 26-year-old had wanted to keep learning. "I know," she said. "I love you as well. I have for quite some time." "I know," he said. "I wanted to say it clearly anyway." "I am glad you did," she said. He smiled. She had seen all the variations of his almost smiles and his half-controlled expressions and his rare moments of unguarded warmth, but this was different from all of them, full and unambiguous and transforming his face entirely, and she thought she might want to see that smile every day for the rest of her life. She held that thought and examined it from all its angles and did not flinch from any of them, including the difficult one, the one that Vestera had gestured at and that she and Dorian had not yet fully spoken, though it lived in the room with them always. Immortality was not a solvable problem. She knew that. He knew that. She was mortal and he was not, and no amount of love changed the mathematics of that. She raised it herself. One evening when they were walking through the lower palace gardens, the carefully maintained space, lit with its moonlight mimicry, the air holding the specific quality of a place that had been tended for a very long time. "I want to talk about the thing we have not talked about," she said. "I know, Zoe," he said. He had known she would raise it eventually. She could tell from his expression that he had been waiting for it without pressure. "I am not afraid of it," she said. "I want you to know that first. I am not asking because I am frightened or because I am looking for a specific answer. I am asking because I want to understand what you think and what you want, not just what the situation presents as fact." He walked for a moment in silence. "I am not going to offer you transformation as a solution," he said finally. "I want that said very clearly. It is an option that exists, but it is not one I would present to you as the resolution to a problem, because you are not a problem to be resolved. If you ever wished to discuss it as a possibility of its own merit, on its own terms, that would be a different conversation. But I will not use it as leverage or as consolation." She had not expected that either. She thought about it for a long time as they walked. "That is a very principled position. It is the only position I can hold and still be honest with you. What do you think about it, as a possibility, on its own terms?" Another long silence. "I think," he said carefully, "that the choice of what you are and what your life is yours and no one else's. I think that I would not experience your mortality as a loss in the way that might be assumed, because every moment of your life, as it is, has a quality of presence that I cannot fully articulate. You live very fully in the time you have. That is not nothing. That is something I watch and find remarkable." He paused. "I also think that if you lived another 60 years and I was there for all of it, that would be among the most significant portions of my entire existence. And if you chose otherwise, at any point, for any reason, that would also be significant in its own way." She stopped walking. He stopped beside her. She looked up at him in the artificial moonlight of his underground garden, and she felt the particular sensation of clarity that came occasionally at very important moments, the sensation of knowing exactly where she was and what she was doing, and that it was right. "I do not need to make any decisions today," she said. "No," he agreed. "We have time." "We have time," she repeated. And the words meant several things at once, and they both knew it, and neither of them tried to reduce them to a single meaning. He offered her his hand, not the formal escort gesture of his official bearing, but simply his hand. Personal and direct, and she took it, and they walked through the rest of the garden, with the light falling around them in its perfect imitation of something that did not reach. This far underground spring arrived in Millhaven, the kind that came late and apologetically after a long winter, and the city slowly returned to itself, and Hearthstone Academy opened its windows to the first genuinely warm air of the year. Anastasia's students were restless with it in the way that young people always were, and she used it rather than fought it. Taking her junior class outside for a literature discussion, on the steps of the building, with the warmth of the April sun on their faces, and Thomas arguing passionately about narrative unreliability with a conviction and precision that made her quietly proud. Felix, who had set Priya's worksheet on fire in September with a vampire child's involuntary pyrokinesis and had since been working with remarkable diligence on his control, sat in the grass and made careful notes in a very new notebook, and did not set anything alight. Priya, who had forgiven him almost immediately and had since become one of his closest friends, sat beside him and stole his pencil every few minutes and returned it before he noticed. Anastasia sat on the steps and watched them and felt the particular depth of satisfaction that came from being exactly where you were supposed to be, doing the exact thing that made the best use of what you had to offer. Her phone vibrated. A message from Dorian. The message said, "How is the class today?" She typed back, and arguing brilliantly. "Felix has not set anything on fire." 3 dots. Then, progress. "Are you free this evening?" She smiled at the phone in the way that she had never expected to smile at a phone message, and had long since stopped being self-conscious about. She typed, "I am. Same time?" "Yes." "And Anastasia, the ventilation system in room 204 is also inadequate. I am consulting you this time." She laughed aloud. Thomas looked up from his argument with an expression of pleased curiosity. "What is it, Miss Hawthorne?" "Nothing," she said. "Go back to your narrator. You were making a good point." He went back. She typed, "I will review the specifications and give you my feedback." The joke landed in the reply. She could tell even through text, the way she was learning to read him in all the registers of his communication, formal and informal, and the quiet ones in between. She put the phone away. Above them, the sky was clear and genuinely blue, and the city of Millhaven went about its complicated human and vampire life, in all its friction and beauty, an improbable coexistence. And the children in her class argued about whether a narrator could be both deluded and deliberately manipulative simultaneously, which was an excellent question with a nuanced answer she was going to let them find themselves. She had thought once that fighting for this school was the most important thing she had done. She still believed that, but she understood now that it had also been the beginning of something else, a series of choices made in the direction of engagement rather than retreat, from the moment she had stood in that underground court and said, "I want to appeal," to the elevator descent, to the first dinner, to the library, to an alley where she had not been helpless so much as temporarily without resources that she had since found in unexpected form. She had walked into the Covenant Court ready to argue for children who were doing something their parents had failed to do. She had not walked in expecting to find Dorian Ashenvale, who was doing something similar in the context of his own world, building something across centuries through patience and principle, and the specific kind of stubbornness that looked like composure, until you knew him well enough to see the effort behind it. That evening, in the underground palace, she sat across from him in the library and told him about Thomas and his argument, and he listened with the complete attention he brought to everything she told him. And when she finished, he said, "What is the answer? Can a narrator be both?" "Yes," she said. "Absolutely yes. A person can be genuinely self-deceived about a specific thing, while simultaneously shaping their account of events to serve a purpose. The delusion and the manipulation operate in different registers, and they coexist without contradiction." He was quiet for a moment. "That is a remarkably sophisticated observation for a junior class discussion." "They are remarkably sophisticated students." She paused. "Tomas will figure it out next week. He always needs exactly one more week with the difficult ones." Dorian looked at her with that full, unguarded warmth she had come to love entirely. Without reservation, the expression that was hers specifically, that she had watched emerge from behind 7 centuries of composure, as though it had always been there waiting for the right reason to surface. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "I am simply aware, very specifically, that I would like to hear about Tomas and his arguments for a very long time." She understood completely what he meant and what he was not saying, the shape of the future that was implied by a very long time spoken by someone for whom that phrase had a different magnitude than it did for most people. "You will," she said simply. "I intend to tell you." He reached across the table, and she took his hand, and the library around them held its centuries of gathered knowledge and the warmth of its preserved light, and outside, above them, the city of Millhaven moved through its night in all its improbable beauty. Human and vampire together in the streets and offices, and schools and courts, not always gracefully, not always without friction, but together. Hearthstone Academy was still standing. Her students were still arguing. Room 204 had a ventilation problem she was going to address through proper consultation. Tomas needed one more week. Felix had not set anything on fire, and Anastasia Hawthorne was in the underground library of the Vampire King of Millhaven, her hand in his, entirely clear about where she was, and who she was, and what she was choosing, without apology and without reservation. The last thing she had expected when she walked into that courtroom 8 months ago, ready to invoke a clause that had not been used in 2 centuries, was this. She had expected a fight. She had expected to win or lose and return to her life. She had expected many things she had not expected to find. In the process of refusing to accept a ruling that everyone told her to accept, the beginning of something that felt less like discovery than like recognition, as though everything that had happened between them had been, in some way she could not fully articulate but wholly believed, already true before either of them had said a word. The fire in the hearth was warm. The books were endless. The night outside went on the way nights did, eventual and patient. The city holding its breath between one moment and the next. And in the morning she would go back to her students, and the school would stand, and everything would continue in its complicated and necessary way. But first, there was this. The room and the warmth and the man across from her, who had remembered the light in rooms 6 centuries gone, who was remembering this too, carefully and completely, adding it to the archive of everything he chose to carry forward. She was content to be remembered that way. She was more than content. She was exactly where she had chosen to be, which was the only place she had ever truly needed to be. "Tell me something," she said. "What would you like to know? Something you have never told anyone else." He considered this with the same seriousness he brought to everything. Then he said, "The city where I was born had a river that turned a specific shade of gold in late afternoon in October. I have not seen that color anywhere since. Every year when October comes, I look for it." She held that for a moment, the weight of what he had given her. What was the river called? He told her the name in the language he had spoken at 26, a language that no longer had living speakers, and the sound of it was unlike anything she had heard, older than anything she had been taught to recognize, and she could not have repeated it, but she felt the shape of it settle into memory with the same permanence as everything else she chose to keep. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you," he replied, "for asking." Outside, the city went on. Inside, the fire burned. Between them, across a table covered in books, something had been spoken that joined the long list of things that would not be forgotten. Not by him, who could not choose to forget, and not by her, who chose to remember. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything.